the Badlands. Explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I am driving this ship solo today, so I'm also using a friend's computer, and I'd like to know if those listening right now can hear my voice fairly well. I'm not certain if the microphone is working, so I'm looking at all right, I think I've got some positive responses from the live chat. It seems like I can be heard, so that's good. All right. Wait a minute, it's not streaming. Good. All right. All right, let's just go back to this. And it says the Rumble stream is not working. Okay, I've got some loud and clears. That's nice. But I'm on Rumble. And despite being on Rumble, I'm not actually seeing my my face come out here. So that's a bit strange. All right, let's just presume. We're going to presume that everything is going to work out. And somehow, despite it not really streaming on Rumble right now, it will be viewable somehow. So I'm going to lean into that confidence of the unknown, and we'll see where this goes. So that being said, welcome. Before we begin anything today, like usual, I'd like to start with a brief word from today's sponsor, who happens to be Rise Attires. So let's just do that.
By now, you've probably seen the new collab between Rise and Badlands Media, but I'll tell you what you haven't seen yet. The end of Clown World as we know it. But have no fear. Introducing the latest addition to the Badlands INTL lineup, the sequel to the best-selling Sci War series. We've been conditioned by these clowns to accept their circus. But it's time to unwind that and strike them out the history books. The future belongs to the real, and we've got it in droves. Go to badlandsmedia.tv/rise for the full line of premium and direct-to-garment streetwear. Made to order right here in the good old US of A, the heart of the resistance. The fall of Clown World is upon us, patriots. Let's make it official.
Okay, so just so people know, I'm in Alberta right now. Gordon's in France with the family, and he'll be back next week. The reason why is obviously there's a lot happening in Alberta. The election of the technocrat Malthusian stooge for the British Empire, Mark Carney, has definitely ruffled some feathers. Whether or not there was election interference or not, I don't know. I know that definitely in my experience as an organizer, an activist, a historian over the past 20 years, I can't say many Canadians are much more brainwashed about the flag and about what it is that this pseudo country actually represents. So I'm prepared to believe that it's possible that enough brainwashed people actually did go and make the choice that they did, locking Canada in at least for 4 years under the helm of the figure of Mark Carney. However, what that 4 years is going to be remains to be seen. We are not in our usual time frame. You know, the flow of physical space-time, the way I see it, is shaped by ideas and a certain physical tension built into the system that we live in, that we're born into. And obviously, at times where human beings are doing well and freedom is running high and courage is running high and morality and conscience, culturally speaking, are doing well, the consequence of that type of culture, of that type of humanity that we've seen at different bursts in our past, results in abundance, results in that tension built into the system being reduced as confidence in the future is increased, as commitments to build things for our grandkids is increased, water projects, things that are going to make the next generation better. That's just the way human beings are. In times where we fall into folly and we allow stupidity to animate our culture for too long, you know, the universe will tolerate a lot. We have free will, but it won't tolerate stupidity and corruption indefinitely. That type of failure to maintain the infrastructure, to maintain the the productive systems, the industrial base upon which our entire society is so dependent, if we allow that to disappear and we allow our food production to shut down as wealth is transferred to a sociopathic inner elite that doesn't really care about humanity, if we allow that to go on, attention due to the scarcity, due to the folly, is going to build up. And like a stick, not every, I like this metaphor. Somebody once, I forget who, I think it was, I forget. An old friend of mine once gave me this example of a stick that slowly bends. And it might seem that every second you count is the same mathematical quality of seconds, 1, 2, 3, 4, but it's not. There's that tension building up at the apex of that stick. And at a certain point, that tension buildup will pass a certain threshold and you'll snap. And human systems, economic systemic breakdowns are kind of like that too. So the time that Mark Carney has found himself to be positioned where he is, representing the types of global anti-human institutions that he does, is concerning. Let's just say it that way. And there aren't very many ideas, especially on the federal level, of what can be done to mitigate or even solve, ideally, the oncoming storm. Thus, we have seen that the Texas of the North, sometimes known as Alberta, has really seen an explosion in independence movements. Whether or not, there's debates over whether the fight for Alberta independence, which is quite the robust. Now that I've seen it with my own eyes, and I've gotten a chance to see some of the figures who are, moving this thing, I'm still on the fence about the quality of leadership. But I think that overall, there's very good ideas. There's definitely a robust cultural dynamic, and whether or not that means that the Alberta independence fight is going to be based around the idea of becoming a republic, independent of the rest of this fake pseudo country called Canada, whether it's going to be join the USA as the 51st state. A lot of people are open to both of those things. Or whether a weaker one is that it might be there's some people who want it to remain under the crown as its own commonwealth, the Commonwealth of Alberta. I think that one might be the weakest of the options available. However, there's still not a lot of discussion about, well, what do you do? So how is a nation? It's nice to say that we're going to have a new country. We've seen separatist movements around the world. Many separatist movements. Czechoslovakia was balkanized, broken up into smaller, separate independent nations. But are they really independent? Well, that's the question, right? The Soviet Union dissolved. Many former Soviet bloc nations became independent nations. Ukraine, others, Belarus. Are they all independent? Well, there were some steps that were skipped. Because how can you be independent if you don't have control of your economic destiny, if you don't have a vision for the future, if you don't have a strategic idea of what your nation, with all of the amazing bounty and resources that Alberta represents, the farming, the natural gas, the oil, all of these things, it's quite astounding. But if you don't have an idea of how do you really build up not just an internal industrial nation that doesn't simply rely on being a resource exporter, you don't want that to be your destiny forever. You want to also be able to grow a full spectrum economy. Well, that means an idea of what that looks like. How is that done? What type of new energy sources in terms of nuclear are available? What type of projects that involve harmonizing with pro-industrial patriots in other parts of the world, in Eurasia, Russia certainly wants to work with the USA on the Arctic. Can that work? What role can Alberta, and ideally Canada, but right now Alberta, play in that broader fight for humanity, which needs to be a global in concept? It has to be a global idea, because that's how the enemy thinks. The oligarchy thinks globally. They don't think locally. They get their victims to obsess about purely local issues without any conceptions of the grand strategy that's shaping contextually their local parts of the world. So hence breaking history. Now, like I mentioned, when the cats are away, the mice will play, and this is going to be yet another little Canadian takeover. But I think it'll be beneficial, because I know in the course of the many presentations that I've given, the many friends that I've made over the past week here in Alberta, that there are a disproportionately large amount of Canadians and Canadian-friendly viewers who are going to be watching this, and I think it'll be beneficial also to Americans. I gave this a variation on this presentation in a smaller form some months back, but I'm going to do this again, and I think the world situation, just being what it is, has made it more appropriate to do so. So the first things first, since Americans often underestimate what is this evil that has kept a hold of this jurisdiction in the North, called the monarchy of Canada, the crown, the mostly crown corporation. When Mark Carney said, to Trump, I don't think the owners of Canada approve of it becoming the 51st state. A lot of people were scratching their heads thinking, what is he talking about? That was the press conference last week. For those in the know or who've paid a little bit of attention, they might have realized that most of Canada is a crown entity. 89% of the territory of the landmass of Canada is crown land, legally under the ownership of the crown as more than the individual sitting in the throne, right? You have crown corporations, crown agents limited. You've got all of these different these emanations of the institution of the crown that manage way more than many people realize. Canada being no exception, and much of the bureaucracy, the civil service of Canada, the many institutions built into Canada, the Bank of Canada, many of the utilities that manage the wealth of Canada are crown corporations. CBC, the biggest broadcasting company funded by the government, is a crown corporation. That means, again, legally, these are not public entities in that sense. They're owned by the institution of the crown. So keep that in mind. And many subversions of the best of the U.S. traditions actually happen largely because really good Americans didn't realize what this thing called Canada was. Many good independence movements and freedom movements in Canada, going back to 1837 and 1838, where there was a Republican rebellion in Canada, too. They were subverted because those patriots who loved the ideal didn't realize what the nature and sophistication of this beast that they were trying to break away from. They didn't realize, and they didn't appreciate the nature of that evil. And within 2 seconds, it was taken down. So we don't want these things to happen within the pregnant moment in history that we are currently living through, and hence being reminded of these historical currents and really sinking the roots of knowledge ever more deeply into the mind is, I believe, very, very important strategically if we're not going to misstep on the minefield. So without further ado, let's begin today's formal remarks, and we're going to go, like I often do when I'm solo, a little bit more classroom oriented. So if people are able to have a little notebook, do that. If not, that's okay too. And we're going to have a bunch of slides. So let's do that. So I've chosen to just title this The Unraveling of the Canadian Enigma and the Mischance of 1867. Just like today, we have a pregnant moment, right? Dense with tension, dense with potential for good or for very bad. 1867, I would say, the 1861 to 1870 period was really, it's not just one year, but that period was, I think, extremely saturated with potential. It was very dense. Again, I like the idea of a pregnant moment. And that's usually where the men are separated from the sheep at that time. You get to really see what you're made of at these periods of crises. And if you don't have enough people who have prepared themselves, then you get a bunch of sheep. You get a bunch of people who freak out and are taken advantage of by their oppressors, those who manufactured many of these crises. So I'm going to call this also an untold history lecture because much of the content it will be found in even greater form in my Untold History of Canada book series, volumes 1 to 4, as well as the Clash of the Two Americas book series, volumes 1 to 4, which are all available on my website, CanadianPatriot.org. So let's just move through these lessons as quickly as we can. The first things first, when looking at history, you got to realize we are living in history, right? So we are not separate from history. History is now. There will be a future, which will be the consequence of our acts of omission or commission. And so we have to be aware that people will be looking back and judging the way we are currently going to be judging certain timeframes in our past, and judging past what we did or didn't do. So that's the first thing. The other thing is that when looking at history from that vantage point, without the separation of the past, the future, and the present, don't separate those things mentally. The other thing to keep in mind is that when looking for what is the truth, you have to ask first, how and why did things happen? The mechanistic how, but also the why, the first principles, the what were the intentions and why, what were the ideas that animated the passions and the thinking of those who conspired for good or for bad to make things happen. So you got to know the why, which is one of those things that has been made increasingly verboten, forbidden in modern academia. And that's an important thing, because in modern academia and modern historiography, people are told to accumulate data about the past, focus on an event, place it in a timeline, write a thesis about the 1614 drought that hit this little district in Amsterdam, and write your master's thesis or your PhD, tying it into global warming and feminist interpretation of the oppression of this gender group at that time. And then, the more you do that, you might get peer reviewed, you might get published, you might get a, God forbid, a job in academia and start brainwashing kids. So that whole, I would say, positivist, radical materialist, positivist philosophy has run rampant, and it rejects the idea that causation is knowable, that you can know causally the why things happen. They say you can't. The real historian, who actually is worth something, will always look to the question of, in whose interest? Why did it happen? What were the ideas at play? And you'll find that in times past, before the 20th century especially, there was a greater abundance of people who called themselves historians and did just that. Those are the people you want to learn from. And the last thing is anomalies. You're always looking for, where does the common theory, the common narrative explaining some part of history fail when I look at the actual evidence that is available to me to explain something that happened in history? Did Napoleon really just try to take over the world because, we're told by Freudian historians that he had a tiny penis and wanted to compensate for his little penis, and thus he wanted to dominate the world, and that's why we had Napoleonic wars for 20 years? That would be insane. That would be insane. Or do we honestly believe that it's satisfying if somebody says, "Oh, Hitler launched World War II because he got kicked out of art school. He was rejected because they didn't like his art, and he had an inferiority complex." And again, the Freudian historians will run amok and say, "Oh, that's satisfying to me. That's we don't have to think about the reasons for World War II anymore. We don't have to think about the Freemasonic Rothschild banks behind Napoleon and the other side, the British as well. We don't have to think about all of the agencies that overthrew the French Revolution, that was trying to be an American Revolution, but were subverted. We don't have to look and investigate that. We don't have to look at the Wall Street City of London Tavistokian psychiatrists that were behind the grooming, the growth, the deployment of Hitler as an agency for a higher power designed to impose a new world order and a eugenics religion onto the social dynamics of that society. We don't have to look at those things. Why? Because we might learn a little bit too much about the ideas that are shaping our current world, and we might be too empowered to solve a lot of the crises of our current world and our current time if we actually looked at it the correct way. So anomalies are key. One of the anomalies for Canadians that I encourage people to chew on, and it blew my mind years ago when I saw it. I've showed this to this audience, but I don't think it really always sinks in, so I'm going to go through this stuff again. Ben Franklin. Why was Ben Franklin on our 2006 Canada Post stamps celebrating the 250 years of postal history of Canada? It's because Ben Franklin was the founder of the Canada Postal Service, one of the earliest and most efficient forms of communications, mass communication, and being able to expand the identity of subjects outside of the local feudal estate or local region that they were born into. The postal service at that time, before the internet, before telegraph and telephones, and that was so important that expand our identities and our minds to be bigger than the local region that we were born into. Ben Franklin, no one but Ben Franklin, the father of the founding fathers, was the founder of the Canadian Postal Service. He was also the founder, for those who don't know, of the first newspapers of Canada. He fought And it wasn't given to Canada by the British Empire. It was fought for by Ben Franklin, who brought in Republican allies from France into Quebec in 1774 and set up the Montreal Gazette. So anomaly, right? This is not in Canadian history books. This is ignored entirely. But these anomalies are cracks in the narrative. They're cracks that give you a sense, a gateway into a more truthful picture if you're an active thinker and not just passively receiving and trying to memorize by rote data on a timeline. But if you're really an active pursuer of truth, a lover of wisdom, a philosopher, if that's the spirit that one has, as Socrates called it, a philosopher is the lover of wisdom, not somebody who has it, but somebody who loves it. If you're experiencing the universe actively, these cracks are gold. That's all about Plato. All of Plato's dialogues is how do we see the paradoxes, how do we see the cracks, and how do we use that to generate better hypotheses about truthfulness that empower us to become more in harmony with the will of the creator. That's Plato. And that's what Ben Franklin was when he was asked, how do you shape your life? Ben Franklin wrote to a friend saying in 1750, as he was discovering the nature of electricity, that I emulate I try to follow my role models, Socrates, Confucius, and Jesus. Those are his three role models. So Socrates, he's a Socratic thinker. And these were the anomalies that he was able to grab onto when he was doing his work on electricity and electrical currents and static electricity. And what was this fire in the sky that no great mind of Europe or academic was able to seemingly understand, but he was. So he was having a more dialogue process with the universe when he was questioning what were the anomalies of this thing that we call electricity. And through that, in 1751, 52, he was, with a grade 3 or whatever, I mean, I don't think he had a formal education, was able to not just trump everybody else in the world, but then apply that discovery to make new inventions, hundreds, that were then also tied to his idea of refining the human culture and bringing humanity more in harmony with God's will, God's law of creation. And his ideas of electricity, if you read his works, were not different or separate from his ideas of natural law in government. There were two sides of the same fight. And he was a capacity builder. He didn't skip steps. He knew that the ideas and the ideals of what he knew were possible in 1730, 1740, of building a nation that would reject hereditary law, would be based upon freedom, that could only happen if you upshifted the culture. And the pursuit of science in that world was to specifically improve and ennoble the minds and souls of the people in order to really demonstrate that everybody could do this. He's not from a rich blue blood family, but despite his lack of high birth, was able to accomplish this creative feat. And with that, everything else that he was saying about the nature of what's wrong with imperial forms of society, of governing, was also could be thrown into the garbage bin. Not what he was saying had to be taken more seriously, but those theories that were then dominant could be thrown into the garbage bin. So Canada, okay, just to be clear. So Canada is based upon the rejection of Benjamin Franklin. He was up here, he was organizing, trying to persuade the Canadians to become the 14th colony in 1776 to join and sign the Declaration of Independence. We said no. Well, that began a series of unfortunate fallacies that became national myths, all wrong, but each more wrong than the one prior, because when you have a wrong foundation and then you build a wrongly designed or conceptualized building on top of the wrong foundation, that will also contain not just the weakness of the foundation, but will have even more weaknesses that will go into the further floors that you wish to build on that building. And so it's a very shaky structure, this thing called Canada, being built on 250 years of fallacy. But that being said, one great fallacy is that the George Washington of Canada, that Canadians are told to adore and admire, is the founder of Canada's founding fathers, the father of Confederation, Sir John A. Macdonald, famously gave a quote saying, "I would be willing personally to leave the whole of the country a wilderness for the next half century, but I fear that if the Englishmen do not go there, then the Yankees will." He's talking about something that's going to be the theme of my presentation. He also famously said, "A Britisher I was born, and a Britisher I will die." This guy, who we're told is the inspiration for the thing that became Canada, who's there on the painting kissing the hand of his adored Queen Victoria. A similarity, since I talked about mischance of 1867, there is a similarity of the two confederacies. Canada is a confederation. That's the type of government. It's a monarchical confederation. There were two British confederations that were designed by British Freemasons, grand strategists during the 19th century to destroy and undermine the success of 1776 and undo the Republic. One was a Northern Confederacy, the other was a Southern Confederacy. And as I made the point in my book series, one of those two British anti-Republican confederacies succeeded, the other failed. The one that failed, we could see the essence of it when we look at the man who would have been the president of the Confederates, the Southern Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, who, after the Civil War, came to Canada with his family and lived and gave speeches across Canada, supporting basically telling the Canadians to not try to be a republic, stay with the British Empire. That was his advocacy mission. And one of the speeches I just clipped out from a transcript in Lennoxville, Quebec in July 1867. He said to all of the people and Dixieland was playing, from the band. And he said, "I hope that you will hold fast to their British principles and that you may ever strive to cultivate close and affectionate connections with the mother country." Jefferson Davis, great hero. Encouraging the Canadians to keep to their British principles. And he's very clear that the core principles that were animating the spirit of his own aspiring confederacy that failed were very British in nature. They were a rejection of the American thinkers, and in fact an embrace of the British imperialist thinkers of John Locke, of Adam Smith, and others who were enshrined even into the Confederate Constitution. Now, one might wonder why it is that even in modern, even in mainstream history courses and textbooks, we are taught that those British imperial pro-slave figures like John Locke, who ran as a director of the British Royal Africa Company and enshrined the institution of slavery as a right of the white man in the Charlottetown Constitution that he himself authored, why that same John Locke is taught to Americans as the inspiration for the American founding fathers, I'll leave that to you folks to guess why. Or Adam Smith, whose Wealth of Nations was published in 1776 and who was directly tied to Lord Shelburne, the enemy of the American Revolution. Why would these British imperial thinkers be the ones we are told were the inspiration for the greatest boons and leaps into progress and freedom? Who's lying to us? This is a little plaque on the side of the Hudson's Bay building in Montreal, Canada. Not that far from where I live, and I'd seen this plaque. They took it down a couple of years ago finally, but it was there for like a century. And it's a plaque in memorial of Jefferson Davis. It was says here the President of the Confederate States, and describes how he lived up there in Montreal, and the Hudson's Bay Company was honoring him with a plaque that was there until 2020. Now, this is an important figure who you may not know. If you do, you get an extra point. Extremely important figure, Lord Alfred Milner, one of the co-authors of the Balfour Accords that generated what became the state of Israel. He was the leader of Cecil Rhodes's Round Table movement, an architect of World War I, a co-architect, and a guy who took control of the British government during World War I and set the stage for what became the League of Nations. He seated his Round Table seated itself into the USA through its American branch known as the Council on Foreign Relations in 1921. And he had this problem, this crisis in 1909, when a lot of Canadians were still very admiring of the successes of Abraham Lincoln and of McKinley. And there was a danger of an economic breakaway of Canada away from the British Empire and towards greater connection with their Republican allies in the South. The idea then at that point was a Zollverein, a customs union that would have involved a protective tariff around Canada and the USA, which would have internal reciprocity and a focus on industrial progress, big projects, the types of which McKinley had been fighting for and Lincoln earlier for rail development, industrial progress. And that idea of money was not based on speculation, but it was tempered by the idea of the productive values and the needs of the society. So a very different idea, and not the same. People say, "Oh, that sounds like NAFTA." This is not NAFTA. But he came to Canada in that crisis, representing the interests of those wishing to keep control of Canada, and they were thinking, "How do we do that? We're losing it." And he describes here in a fantastic quote where he says, "As between the three possibilities for the future, which is number one, closer imperial union, that is a more federated, consolidated British Empire as a federation, an imperial union, sort of a prototype for the League of Nations and world government that he had been advocating." But he said, okay, number one, closer imperial union is one option. Number two, union with the USA. And number three, independence. I believe definitely that number two is the real danger. I do not think the Canadians themselves are aware of it. They are wonderfully immature in political reflection on the big issues and hardly realize how powerful the influences are. On the other hand, I see little danger to the ultimate imperial unity in Canadian nationalism, and air quote nationalism. On the contrary, I think the very same sentiment makes a great many, especially of the younger Canadians, vigorously and even bumptiously assertive of their independence, proud and boastful of the greatness and the future of their country, and so forth. It would lend themselves, tactfully handled, to an enthusiastic acceptance of imperial unity on the basis of partner states, and in quotes. This tendency is therefore, in my opinion, rather to be encouraged, not only as a safeguard against Americanization, but as actually making, in the long run, for a union of all the Britons. So again, he's literally saying how wonderful it is that these Canadians are wonderfully immature in political reflection on the big issues, and they don't realize how powerful the influences are. He loves it. So this is just, I think, characteristic of the type of social engineer that has shaped and misshapen so much of the psyche of the Canadians. People wonder, how is it that Canadians could, at this point, vote for somebody like a Mark Carney and the Liberals? You got to realize the level of brainwashing runs deep and thick, and the idea of creating a pseudo-nationalism that would be based upon anti-Americanism, not actually based upon freedom or what do you want to build for your future, which is a viable nationalism, but a fake nationalism. That's exactly something that was surgically created by the entire Rhodes network that generated the Roundtable movement, like I said, the Rhodes Trust, the Rhodes Scholars, that infused themselves generation after generation, both into Canada, into the Canadian High Command, but also into the US High Command, which may be in a future chat, we could talk about that. So let's jump to today, because I said history is all about the present. So today's potentials, we got outer space as one frontier. We got the Arctic as another frontier. These are two domains that are currently moving into the question, or have been, but are really accelerating into the question of, will they be the platforms of cooperation around sovereign nations working together for the greater good of their people, or is it going to be based upon war? We know that there's a lot of discussion. I've spoken to people who are directly implicated in working on scenarios to prepare for the weaponization, the militarization of space. Directed energy weapons seem to be a factor already in play that are not even legal, but they're there. Is that what space is going to be? Is that what the Arctic, of which Canada has a big chunk of it, is that what it's going to be? A platform for long-range missiles, hypersonic missiles, for the coming war with Russia and China? Or is it going to be based upon the ideas of John F. Kennedy, who offered the Russians and other nations to work together on going to our limits and beyond, in making discoveries and changing the limits to growth? Is that what these things will be? We know that the Artemis Accords, which has a very different spirit as far as the Artemis Accord principles are concerned, released in May of 2020, that call for the idea that peace is the basis upon which space policy will be formulated. There's a picture of a bunch of Russian and American cosmonauts and astronauts, and an Italian. And one article of it pointed out that international cooperation on Artemis is intended not only to boost space exploration, but to also enhance peaceful relationships between nations. Therefore, at the core of the Artemis Accords is the requirement that all activities will be conducted for peaceful purposes per the tenets of the Outer Space Treaty. The Outer Space Treaty being John F. Kennedy's baby, that called for ensuring that everybody would agree formally that space would be only something for exploration and improving the human condition and knowledge, and not for weaponizing or extending geopolitics into that domain. The Arctic, like I said, the China Polar Silk Road is a new extension of the Silk Road that calls for a paradigm of really building new cities, high-speed maglev rail into the Arctic as a new frontier. Canada could definitely play a role. We know that President Trump in his first term endorsed the A2A Alaska to Alberta Railway, premised around the idea of an east-west cooperative business strategy that would have built rail from Alaska into Alberta, connecting that there's no rail. There's some road, but there's no rail. Without that, you really can't access the abundance of resources that could do a lot of good for humanity all throughout the northern part of Canada. So this is a really strategic maneuver on several different fronts at the same time. I haven't heard this discussion come back in the second term. A2A did fizzle out. There's a new type of company that the leaders of A2A have created. It definitely could play a positive role, but we'll see. But that's the sort of vision that I'm saying. If there's going to be a viable Republican movement that is pro-independence, you have to have a vision, or without that, the people perish. You have to have these types of grand programs that are both good for your people, but also good for the global chemistry that you find yourself in. Now let's jump back to 1867. Henry C. Carey, the leading economic advisor to Abraham Lincoln, had written a book called The Harmony of Interests in 1851. In it, he says that two systems are before the world. One looks to increasing the proportion of persons and of capital engaged in trade and transportation, and therefore to diminishing the proportion engaged in producing commodities with which to trade, with necessarily diminished returns to the labor of all. While the other looks to increasing the proportion engaged in the work of production and diminishing that engaged in trade and transportation, with increasing returns to all, giving to the laborer good wages and to the owner of capital goods profits. One looks to pauperism, ignorance, depopulation, and barbarism. The other an increasing wealth, comfort, intelligence, combination of action, and civilization. One looks towards universal war, the other towards universal peace. One is the English system. The other we may be proud to call the American system, for it is the only one ever devised, the tendency of which was that of elevating while equalizing the condition of man throughout the world. 1851, he could see that the two global systems were colliding and coming on fast. He could see that it was becoming increasingly inevitable, that unless saner heads were to prevail, that a civil war could feasibly shred the U.S. Republic and the ideals of 1776. And he knew what that meant. But the idea that he understood it as a global system fight is so important, and that one system, they look similar, but one system calling itself capitalism is the British system, and it's actually the City of London. It's the British East India Company, utilizing capitalism as a front in order to impose feudalism and genocide on target audiences by the idea of British free trade, saying you're not allowed to have protectionism. A nation cannot direct its own credit. It can't, right? That breaks the rules of Adam Smith. You can't do that. And so China, you sign the free trade agreement, take the opium, smoke it, right? You signed it. It's a good business. Same thing for India. We got the free trade agreement with you. You got to export your food to other countries of the Commonwealth that want that need that we want to bring that food to, even if it means starvation and famine for you. Same thing for Ireland. That was very different from the American system. And again, that's just the global system of control of dependency of the British Empire in the 19th century. Cotton from the South being sent to England to be turned into manufacturing that they controlled because they destroyed the manufacturing of India, who they then now control the textiles that they bring into India. But the Indians that don't have manufacturing anymore, because that was destroyed, they can produce opium. That opium that they then produce, because the climate's right, will then allow them to make money off of selling it to China, who now is too doped up and destroyed by drugs that they can't actually stand on their own 2 feet. And then they pay silver for the opium that then is enriching the city of London evermore. And the system of dependency of control is there. And this only works if the nations who are tricked into signing on do not have full spectrum economies. If they only have a dependency on export of raw materials of one sort or another, or cheap labor or drugs, then if that's the income revenue of those nations, then they cannot stand on their own 2 feet. And it becomes much more conducive for organized crime syndicates to emerge, shaped as they are and always have been, whether in India or the Green Dragon Gang of China that generated the triads, or the deep state apparatus in North America. It's always the same organized crime syndicates that utilize things like the Italian mafia, the Sicilian mafia, the Corsican mafia, the Jewish mafia, the Bronfmans, that will utilize these organized crime networks as a tool of imperial control. It's not separate as Hollywood movies or have seemed to make it. It's not that. It's part of the thing. And just a quick display of the effects of these two different opposing concepts of capitalism of the 19th century. I would say even the current day that we're living in too. But the effects then were, on the left, the British system of feudal capitalism, imperial capitalism. So it's not really capitalism because it's destroying capital. The effects of it is to destroy the potential for generating capital. So it's anti-capitalistic, ironically. You've got a bunch of suffering Indians, 20 genocidal famines controlled by the British Empire during their time corralling and controlling India as the crown jewel, 20 famines controlled under Malthusian population control science was done under the name of free markets. On the right, you got a display of an etching of the 1876 Centennial Exhibition that was organized by Henry C. Carey to demonstrate to the world the success of the superior American system and what could be accomplished by this young country, growing in population and industrial output to supersede even that of the greatest power economically, Britain, in a very short time. And world leaders, delegations from Japan, China, South America, Africa, well, not so much Africa at the time, but Germany, Russia came down and explored how America did it and brought back the Abraham Lincoln American systems techniques into their own countries in varying degrees. Lincoln understood this battle as well in a way that I think people don't appreciate. In 1858, he pointed out after a debate or during a debate with Stephen Douglas, the pro-slavery Democrat that he was fighting for the Senate. He had said that this is the issue that will continue in this country when these poor tongues of Judge Douglas and myself shall be silent. It is the eternal struggle between these two principles, right and wrong, throughout the world. So not just American, he's thinking globally. They are the two principles that have stood face to face from the beginning of time and will ever continue to struggle. The one is the common right of humanity, and the other, the divine right of kings. And he did not make it ambiguous. He recognized that the slave ethos, the slave power ethos of the Confederacy was that premised that it was legally defensible to include within the topic of private property other human beings that were being bred like cattle and used instead of going for machinery and industrial progress. They said, no, let's stick with this agrarian way that our grandfathers did it. It's our tradition. But that tradition is pretty sick if it allows defining property as people. And he recognized that idea was very much tied to the global British imperial idea that had been plaguing humanity for so many millennia around the divine right of kings, that the authority to rule should come through just your better blood, and that alone is adequate. The vice president of the Confederacy, and I am saying this here, Alexander Stephens, February 1st, 1861. I say this here because there's a romanticization and a rehabilitation of the Confederacy, especially amongst many good conservatives that I know. And I really want to get it clear that the Confederacy was not going to phase out slavery. Just listen to Vice President Alexander Stephens, who had said, "Our Confederacy is founded upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based on this great physical and moral truth." All right, Alexander Stephens. Also, just to point out that the Confederacy, which you see there in red, actually had a constitution that can be read by anybody here online right now. You can go on, read the Constitution that they wanted to enshrine to replace the U.S. 1787 Constitution. So their Constitution actually enshrines not just slavery, but the illegalization of any future chance of anyone ever to illegalize the institution of slavery forever. The abandonment of slavery is illegalized in that actual Constitution. Additionally, the illegalization of protectionism and state intervention into improving manufacturing is also illegalized in their Constitution. It's quite extreme. So the conditions upon which this fight was built was not ambiguous for those who were actually waging it. And people say, oh, it wasn't about Lincoln said in this out of context statement to Horace Greeley that if he could stop the war without freeing any slave, he would do it. And thus he didn't care about slavery at all. No, that's first of all, an out of context quote. In the entirety of Lincoln's entire life, from a young lawyer in Illinois all the way to his murder, he was consistent against slavery. That was a deep running passion in his mind. He was also a follower of Henry Clay and would describe himself as a Clay Republican. That's Canada at the time, 1867. What you have there is the Hudson's Bay Company representing more than half of the surface area of Canada. You got some Northwest Territories right next to Russia. Russia there in yellow on the upper left-hand side. And then you got Quebec, Ontario, and a couple of maritime colonies. And there on the left is New Caledonia, known as British Columbia, separated from the east by quite a measure. You have the Red River Colony in the middle, where there was a couple of rebellions under Louis Riel in the 1870s, 1880s, till he was executed. He had some problems, though. Anyway, he thought he was the Messiah. It was a bit strange. But so this is the battleground, and the United States is there in green below. So Hudson's Bay land, Hudson's Bay Company, where Jefferson Davis had his plaque, his memorial plaque, even up until our recent times. That's a factor. The British North America Act literally says that Canada exists in order to conduce to the welfare of the provinces and promote the interests of the British Empire. That's the Canadian Constitution of 1867. That was actually written during the Civil War in 1864. It took a few more years for it to be ratified in the British Parliament. And like I said, unlike other countries, our country exists to promote the interests of the British Empire. It also enshrines things like the Privy Council office, the Privy Council, the Governor Generals, these unelected agencies that would have the directive control of our government over that of the elected branch of the Commons, given its name for the word commoner, because it's the house for the commoners to have a bit of representation. It's a very derogatory, I would say, term. Again, Jefferson Davis, I hope that you will hold fast Canadians to their British principles, and that you may ever strive to cultivate close and affectionate connections with the mother country. Just to restate that quote. 1863 to 71. Ambassador Stoker, the Russian ambassador to the USA, great statesman. This guy's incredible. Writes to Foreign Minister Gorchakov in 1860, saying, the disintegration of the United States as a nation would, from our point of view, be something to be deplored. The American Confederation has acted as a counterpoise to British power, and in this sense, its continued existence constitutes an important element in the balance of power. He continued that he desired the preservation of the American Union as an indivisible nation. So that's the Russian ambassador, very much taking sides and recognizing the importance of the survival of the USA as an indivisible nation. Inversely, let's see another foreign statesman commenting on the new Civil War in 1861, Lord Robert Cecil, Marquis of Salisbury, who became prime minister soon thereafter 3 times, wrote, saying, the northern states of America can never be our true friends because we are rivals politically, rivals commercially. With the southern states, the case is entirely reversed. The population are an agricultural people. They furnish the raw materials of our industry, and they consume the products which we manufacture from it. With them, every interest must lead us to cultivate friendly relations, and when the war began, they at once recurred to England as their natural ally. And he's telling the truth. In fact, the Confederacy immediately, through people like Teddy Roosevelt's uncle, Bulloch, James Bulloch, who was the Confederate the leader of the Confederate intelligence for Europe, who oversaw the negotiations with Lord Palmerston and Lord Robert Cecil, to build warships that were used, like the SS Alabama, in the war against the Union. The supply of weapons that the British supplied to the Confederacy, and food and munitions. All of these things were very, very indicative of the way Britain wanted, as well as their on the ground logistical support. That was indicative of the direction that the British Empire wished to see the Civil War unfold. And I would also add, within that context, the Confederate operations that the British gave access to in Canada, which were abundant in St. Lawrence Hall, Montreal, as the headquarters of the Canadian branch of Confederate intelligence that oversaw the murder of Lincoln and many other things, that worked with the bankers of Montreal and Ontario, that were the British hand in North America, along with Wall Street, that were carrying out economic warfare, speculative attacks against the US dollar, and especially the newly emergent greenback that Lincoln began in 1862. These are all factors that are ignored, as far as I could see, by almost any mainstream, respectable historian. And so what did Russia do? Well, what we have here are several battleships that Russia had sent to New York. He also sent warships to the coast of San Francisco, both of which were a direct message to the imperialists of France and England, saying that if you get in this war overtly, you're doing it covertly now, but if you do it overtly, it's war with Russia. And that kept the imperial powers of Europe at bay. That's another picture of the Russians being welcomed off of the Alexander Nevsky flagship. There you have an etching of a parade in celebration of the Russian heroes coming down to save the United States during 1863. And there you have Tsar Alexander II. That's actually his face here. Alexander II, who is known as the Great Liberator because he liberated the 25 million serfs of Russia and declared war against the landed aristocracy, the old nobility that wanted to keep feudalism in play in Russia. He went to war with his new allies that had taken power after the Crimean War, and ensured that the serfs went free. And he then had the additional challenge, similar to that of Lincoln a month later, who passed the Emancipation Proclamation, which is with these millions of people that are going to be freed, how do you train them? How do you upshift the culture so that they can become transform from the identity of slaves to real productive citizens? That requires schooling, trades, opportunities for work. It's a big challenge. So Alexander II was up to it, but he was up to it knowing that he needed the United States for this to work. And here's a quote published by Wharton Barker, a pro-Lincoln industrial banker who ran a newspaper called The Independent, and he had an interview with Tsar Alexander II and published it in 1904. I don't know why he waited so long, but anyway, there might have been a republishing of the thing. But Alexander II says that in the autumn of 1862, the governments of France and Great Britain proposed to Russia in a formal but not an informal official way. In a formal but not in an official way, the joint recognition by European powers of the independence of the Confederate States of America. My immediate answer was, I will not cooperate in such action, and I will not acquiesce. On the contrary, I shall accept the recognition of the independence of the Confederate States by France and Great Britain as a casus belli for Russia. And in order that the governments of France and Great Britain may understand that this is no idle threat, I will send a Pacific fleet to San Francisco and an Atlantic fleet to New York. All this I did because of love for my own dear Russia. I acted thus because I understood that Russia would have a more serious task to perform if the American Republic with advanced industrial development were broken up, and Great Britain should be left in control of most branches of modern industrial development. Powerful, powerful quote. This should be in every textbook. As far as just getting across the why, the big illegal question, though, why did it happen? He says so, what his intention was. And right there is a big statue that exists to this very day. It was built up it was built, I think, in the early 2000s, of Alexander II on the right, and Abraham Lincoln shaking hands. Now, the reality is that these two men never physically met in person. However, art gives us the ability to communicate the essence of things, and this beautiful statue exists in Moscow Square, or not Moscow. It exists in downtown Moscow. This is something that Russians take very seriously, and it's something that Americans have been brainwashed to forget ever happened. But this is, I think, one of the most strategic battle lines today is this reviving of the historic alliance of Russia and the USA that saved the USA at times of great crises. We'll skip that one. General Nikolai Moravv, writing to Tsar Alexander II just before the Civil War, where he had the foresight to see where the winds were going, and he was more optimistic that the U.S. could be saved. And he said that the ultimate rule of the United States over the whole of North America is so natural that we must ourselves sooner or later recede. But we must recede peacefully, in return for which we might receive other advantages from the Americans. Due to the present amazing development of railroads, the United States will soon spread over all of North America. We must face the fact that we will have to cede our North American possessions to them. He's talking about the transcontinental railway, the world's first begun. The year that the Russians came to America was the year that Lincoln, who had now he generated the greenbacks as a tool to get around the City of London and Wall Street banks that wouldn't lend any money to the Union without usurious 25% interest that would have broken the Union easily. He got around it by issuing his own treasury-backed greenbacks, utilizing Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. And through that, and also 520 bonds that gave the right to, by the end of the war, represented $1 billion of monetized capital that was like floating as currency. He was able to do a lot, not just fight the war, but also build the, again, world's first transcontinental railway as the first phase of a multi-phase design for a new industrial renaissance that did involve Russia. Let's see how. For example, Russia in 1867, March 30th, sold Alaska to the United States for $7 million. It was called Seward's Folly. One of the most brilliant flanking maneuvers ever witnessed before. And there you have Ambassador Edward de Stoker with his hand on top of Alaska, sitting down as William Seward, the Secretary of State, who survived his own assassination attempt the very night that Lincoln had been murdered. You have there Charles Sumner in the pick. And that was a big deal because it wasn't just to sell land to the United States. It was to sell a new idea of cooperation, especially around rail through the Bering Strait. I'll just say it. And Lincoln even had given a speech before he died at his first State of the Union in 1864 December, where he described this plan of extending rail and telegraph lines through the Bering Strait, which was made an act and passed in Congress, and it was passed in the Senate. So it was actually, it had been given the full support of the government. But he gave this speech, and in it he said, the proposed overland telegraph between America and Europe by way of the Bering Strait and Asiatic Russia, which was sanctioned by Congress at the last session, has been undertaken under very favorable circumstances. Assurances have been received from most of the South American states of their high appreciation of the enterprise and their readiness to cooperate in the construction lines tributary to that world encircling communication. And let's leave that on a quick cliffhanger for the moment as we shift gears to the other sponsor for today. Ride's tired. My battery's about to run low, so let's do this fast. All right, River BTC. River, here we go. All right. Did you know that Bitcoin is now the top 5 global asset? Now's the time to buy, and River's here to help. Prepare to maximize your Bitcoin returns with the emotion. Introducing River AI, a Bitcoin advisor at your fingertips. Stop trying to time the market. Do it with confidence. At River, you get 0 free recurring buys, 3.8% Bitcoin interest on cash, US-based support, business accounts, and so much more. Don't forget about Bitcoin interest on cash, which can accelerate your business growth too. Businesses can now earn 3.8% interest on cash paid in Bitcoin. That's more money to fuel your next big move. Get started at badlandsmedia.tv/river. Move your cash to River today and start earning a real interest rate with Bitcoin. The future is now. That's badlandsmedia.tv/River. Okay. So, who are the Lincoln allies in Russia? Well, that's a few of the key ones that I would say. Sergei Witte is the transport minister in 1890, working very closely with Alexander III. Alexander II having now been assassinated the same year that Garfield is assassinated, both by anarchist assassins launched by British intelligence as proxies, not dissimilar to how the Anglo-American and Zionist intelligence utilizes things like ISIS or other radical movements as proxies to destabilize governments that they don't like or take out leaders that they don't like, Gaddafi being one. Same thing back then. In that case, it was typically anarchist terrorists that were utilized, generated, brainwashed in communes, peppered throughout Russia, throughout Canada, throughout the USA, north of, New York, Buffalo, Chicago was full of these communes. Emma Goldman had one. Anyway, Charles Guiteau, who killed Garfield, came out of another one. The guy who blew up Alexander II came out of another one, organized by Prince Kropotkin. Anyway, big story. That's a separate issue, or a separate class, same issue, separate class. That to say, the American system founders or leaders in Russia at the time, Sergei Witte, who became then later the first prime minister of Russia, the founder of the current modern Duma was Witte. And he also worked as foreign minister, a grand strategist, very close ally with Otto von Bismarck, creating peace agreements, back-channel peace agreements and cooperative negotiation, which was only undermined when Bismarck was ousted and Bismarck's allies were taken down and Germany became more stupid and more inclined to walk into traps, which they finally culminated in the First World War. But you had also under him, you had the finance minister of the 1870s, 80s, Ivan Vyshnegradsky. You had Tsar Alexander II. You got Dmitry Mendeleev, who came to the United States in 1876 and studied the American system for weeks and then brought it back and became the chairman of the Committee on the Protective Tariff for Russia. That was the great chemist, scientist, discoverer of the Mendeleev table of the periodic occurrence of elements in the universe. So that Mendeleev was also a grand strategist for the science of human economy and industrial growth, and his role refuting Adam Smith's doctrines of free trade can still be read, and I included some excerpts of it in my volume 1 of The Clash of the Two Americas, if people do want to take a bit more of an intellectual plunge into this topic. William Gilpin was the first governor of Colorado Territory, one of the 13-man team of Abraham Lincoln's elite bodyguard that kept Lincoln alive and beyond past 2 assassination attempts. Just en route from Illinois to Washington, D.C. after elected, that same William Gilpin, who is known as the father of Manifest Destiny, had an international perspective, and that's one of the maps that he commissioned, portraying the North American rail line through Alaska, through the Bering Strait, and onward through into Eurasia, Africa, and beyond. So this is an idea published in 1890 that was in circulation, shaping discussion and strategy. Again, I'm in Alberta right now, but I think the precedents for a lot of what the Albertans are currently facing around their independence struggle have some precedents in what the fight over British Columbia was at this very time. Because British Columbia, separated as it was by this giant landmass and the private Hudson's Bay land, that became very, you can imagine, high real estate, especially with both Russians and Americans planning to extend Lincoln's rail line through British Columbia into Russia that was needed for the Bering Strait. So what was that going to be? Would they break free from the British Empire and join the United States? Or would they somehow get tricked into staying with the empire? We know the answer. Hindsight's 2020. But that being said, let's get into the drama. The American consul of Victoria, BC, Alan Francis, had written back to Washington saying that even the colonists claiming most loyalty to the Queen are now urging with great unanimity annexation to the United States as their only salvation, as the only means of retrieving the colonies from their present embarrassment and decline. The colonies, I mean, British Columbia was economically devastated. The gold rush bubble, which was a speculative bubble, had popped by this time. People were starving. They had no viable economy. Their only economic relationship really was with California. It wasn't with the other colonies of Canada on the east. It wasn't with the mother colony. It was with California. So it's serious. There was an annexation movement that was taking form really quickly. In the 1867 Colonist newspaper, you have an editorial on the front page that reads, "Since no change would be for the worse, they, the British Columbians, would welcome annexation to the United States to continuing in a state of poverty and of wretchedness. In writing this, we know we speak the mind of 9 out of every 10 men in the colony. The sentiment is heard at every gathering street corner, at social gatherings, in business circles, in all places." And you had an 1869 annexation petition, which at the very end, I'm not going to read it, but at the very end, it says, "For these reasons, we earnestly desire the acquisition of the colony by the United States." And it looked like that was where things were going. So why didn't, with all of the support, nearly unanimous popular support, many of the leading business officials in BC were also supporting joining the USA. Why did it fail? You know, you even had here a cartoon featuring John Bull and a bunch of warships behind him. And he says, "All right, Sems, fire away. Be off with you, damn Yankee." And it's called John Bull's Neutrality, a Distinction with a Difference. And it's a Harper's Weekly cartoon of 1862 featuring John Bull calling for the destruction of the Yankees. And Sems is the captain of the SS Alabama that took down something like 90 Union ships during the Civil War, made by the British and Lord Palmerston. And at the time in 1870, you had the world's first international court case with the United States being defended by Ulysses S. Grant. And the British were found guilty of illegally supporting the breakup of the Union and had to pay a fine. And whether that fine was going to be Canada was up for grabs. And you had people like William Seward, Charles Sumner, the senator, who and many others were of the view that no, we need to make Britain pay by giving us Canada finally, make Canada part of the Republic. Unfortunately, more pragmatic, or I guess practically minded assholes won the day. And for whatever reason, Ulysses S. Grant, who's generally a good guy, but a little bit naive on some of these questions, became convinced that you could somehow be friends with a more well-behaved Great Britain. And basically he accepted the offer that Britain pay $15 million as a big I'm sorry and be friends again. So that's what happened. That being said, that was a lot of momentum was there to acquire Canada. So again, why did it fail? And let's see, the monarchist counterattack is a big one. Again, we already saw the picture of John Macdonald, the guy who called for creating out of Canada an officially Aryan nation that would not give the right of vote to any non-Aryan or Teutonic ethnicity. And people say, oh, you got to forgive him for his racism. It was the times. That's just the way people were. And it's like, well, actually, he was the only member of parliament at that time to take the position that he took. Everybody else thought it was way too horrific and racist and did not support him. So he's exceptionally bad, but yet still treated like a great hero with statues and building names and street names all over Canada. It's weird. I mentioned here I would be quite willing personally to leave the whole of the country a wilderness for the next half century, but I fear that if the Englishmen do not go there, the Yankees will. Are you serious? That's what he's talking about. Now you know what that quote meant. That if the British don't allow for industrial progress and the building of its own railway across Canada, connecting the East with British Columbia, then the Yankees will certainly take that region and surround the British Canada, which involves building rail and other things that the Yankees will certainly do, connecting up into Alaska. If the United States, this is Sir Alexander Galt, another founding father of Canada, father of Confederation, who wrote Great Hero, May 22nd, 1867. If the United States desire to outflank us on the west, we must accept the situation and lay our hand on British Columbia and the Pacific Ocean. This country cannot be surrounded by the United States. We are gone if we allow it. From the Atlantic to the Pacific must be the cry in British America as much as it has ever been in the United States. So basically, it's like a perverse manifest destiny, a perverse version that they need to create to try to rebrand manifest destiny around an idea of something more imperial and something more based upon keeping Canada as a wedge, preventing U.S.-Russian collaboration. Georges-Etienne Cartier, that's another picture of the Rupert's Land over Canada, run by a bunch of Jesuits, keeping it underdeveloped. He said that in this country, we must have a distinct form of government in which the monarchical spirit will be found. So again, the idea of monarchy, the divine right of kings, that has to be the principle that organizes every other consideration in the governing structure of the type of society that he wished to create, not the idea that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with inalienable rights. Those were offensive to the monarchical thinkers, the divine rights of king crowd. So what do? They did build that rail, and that rail was finally built in 1885. It was called the national policy of Macdonald. It took 15 years, a lot of corruption. Finally got built, and it was part of a bribe. And what they basically said is, well, we have to quickly find a way to buy up and so-called nationalize Rupert's Land, which they did in 1869 or 1870 through an act of Parliament of London. And once that was out of the way, then they were at least able to get over one hurdle. The next hurdle being, well, how do you connect British Columbia with the rest of the East? Well, to that requires rail. So they promised the rail, and they promised to absolve British Columbia of all of its massive unpayable debts. At the time, the annexation movement leaders still were able to say no, but they were being defended by Frederick Seymour, the governor, an anti-imperial, but yet ironically British, or he was actually I think he was Irish. He was an Irish civil servant who was at the time positioned as governor of British Columbia, who was defending the annexation movement, trying to buy them time. But the Americans were too slow. They underestimated the evil of the British Empire. Seymour ends up getting killed, conveniently. His replacement is a Johnny Macdonald puppet, who then accelerates British Columbia's joining into Confederation with the promise of the rail, and thus locking this colony of the West into the British Crown's system of controls. And just to say, that's the tragedy that derailed this beautiful orientation towards building the Bering Strait Railway. There are a history of great Canadians that did emerge over the years that I write about in my book series that have been almost scrubbed completely out of history, of which you have people like Thomas Kiefer on the upper left, a great rail development industrialist and Republican. You had Isaac Buchanan, a fighter for Canadian independence, an industrialist who kept Canada neutral during the Civil War. That was Isaac Buchanan. You had William Hamilton Merritt, a big hydroelectric dam builder of the 19th century, and Wilfrid Laurier, who was trying to create a customs union with the Republic in 1911 when he was taken down by the Round Table in a coup d'etat that Alfred Milner organized. That was why Alfred Milner was in Canada, figuring out how do we manipulate and create a fake pseudo-nationalism to prevent Americanization. That was due to Wilfrid Laurier, who was a lover of Abraham Lincoln. And he had a vision of having a Canada of 60 million people by the 1940s with full electrification. He was a visionary, but he had to be taken down. On the bottom left, you have O.D. Skelton, one of the key foreign ministers of Canada, who went to war with the Rhodes Scholars and kept the Rhodes Scholars from taking control of Canada's Department of External Affairs until he was killed in 1940 in a very strange car accident. You have at the right C.D. Howe, Clarence Decatur Howe, an American-born engineer who became Canada's Minister of Everything during and after World War II, who was behind the growth of Canada's nuclear CANDU reactor system, our Avro Aero hypersonic jets, and many more things. Then he was eventually taken down in a bit of a weird process as well. W.A.C. Bennett, with the hard hat, the Premier of British Columbia of the 1950s, 60s, who was behind the growth of the hydroelectric dams of the Peace River, of the Columbia River Treaty of the South, where Canada, BC, built some major hydro dams under Bennett. He forced the nationalization of Power Corps, a private entity that was preventing BC from utilizing and developing its hydro potential. And he went to war with this thing. and forced the nationalization, creating BC Hydro. He created a Bank of BC to allow for the emission of productive credit, not dissimilar from the principle that Lincoln had tapped into in the formation of the greenback system and the type of national bank architecture that Lincoln had done that allowed for the creation of credit for large-scale projects that could then be monetized and used for circulation currency by your average businessman and citizen. Similar thing was done by Franklin Roosevelt at the same time during the New Deal, which involved taking control of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and utilizing it as an instrument of a national bank, effectively, to grow all of these massive infrastructure visionary projects that were very long-term in scope. And he forced Mariner Eccles, a pro-industrial, anti-speculative friend, into the position of chairman of the Federal Reserve, and forced the Fed for the very first time and probably only time to abide by the law of the nation and actually permit for the non-sabotage, at the very least, of the RFC, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. So that W.A.C. Bennett applied the Lincoln FDR model to BC, and unfortunately, after he was ousted and his eco-fascist son took control as the NDP Fabian Society premier of BC and undid many of his father's accomplishments, his Bank of BC became the conduit that was selected by HSBC, the Hongsheng Bank of Commerce, run by the City of London, to get into North America, which it soon did. It bought up the Bank of BC, transplanting it like a virus into a healthy blood cell, having it then become the instrument for drug money laundering and the golden triangle of funneling drugs and drug money laundering, but drugs from the golden triangle of Cambodia and Laos and Thailand into North America from that direction. So that's part of that history, that very interesting but very sad tragedy. On the right is Daniel Johnson Sr., the Premier of Quebec of the Union National Government, who had taken power in 1966 and had earlier been the Minister of Natural Resources during the 1950s. And it was through his leadership that Quebec had been able to break free of its underdevelopment and become a hydroelectric engineering powerhouse, but not because of Ottawa, but because of Bennett. And he and Bennett had a special relationship where Bennett said, okay, we've got all of this abundance that we have generated by building our rail, building our mines, building our industry, building our hydroelectric power in British Columbia, outside of the authority of the saboteurs in Ottawa. But now that we have all of this bounty and abundance, let's provide you a loan, because Quebec at the time on the other side of the continent was being choked of credit by Ottawa and the Bank of Canada. And so rather than expect any help on these kinds of things from Ottawa, Daniel Johnson and company basically created a special relationship with British Columbia, and province to province were able to help each other. And $100 million loan was given by Bennett to Quebec to launch the industrial renaissance movement of dam building that has given Quebec such sovereignty over its energy policy. And unfortunately, it's been abused under free trade, which forces much of it to be sold for fractions of its worth, to keep the U.S. dependent on Canada's cheap hydroelectric power, while the British Empire laughs, utilizing corporate shells. And Quebec, which doesn't get the type of revenue that it could otherwise get for that sale, and because it's actually cheaper to sell that electricity, it's cheaper for Americans to buy that electricity than it would be for Canadians to buy that same electricity. It's part of, again, the North American Free Trade Agreement disaster. It's created a system of inequalities and amplified the hostility felt between nations. Quebec, which receives billions of dollars of revenue from Alberta, which is not allowed to go into an actual nation building. We shut down, in fact, our advanced nuclear reactors of Quebec that we once had, and instead became dependent upon a fixed resource. There's only so much water flow that you can get out of these rivers. You can't go further than a certain limit. So there's all of this hostility, and the British have made sure to keep Canada as divided amongst itself as possible for the past 150 years. The provinces have never even been allowed to have free trade with each other. There's protective blocks between each province to keep Canada as divided as humanly possible, so that those wishing to control the entire continent have done so through agencies like the Bilderberg Group, and other things that people, So anyway, that's a sad story. Now, Daniel Johnson is another great hero who invited President Charles de Gaulle to come to Quebec and say, "Vive la Québec libre, long live free Quebec." And there was a broader strategy around breaking free of empire with the help of de Gaulle and with the help of Bobby Kennedy. Ironically, something as a quick thought to hold in mind as a factor, were all at the time organized through the Catholic Church. Quebec at that time, before it had been de-Christianized, was still, Daniel Johnson was a devout Christian. He was a Catholic. So was Bobby Kennedy. So had John F. Kennedy been. So had Charles de Gaulle been. So had Adenauer been of Germany. So at the time, there was something much more potent and patriotic that was utilizing the Catholic Church as an infrastructure for fighting this transhumanist death cult that was at this very time killing world leaders, nationalists, and trying to take control of the levers of influence over society. And he was also killed in 1968. Daniel Johnson, the morning he was to unveil the Manicouagan 5 hydroelectric dam, one of the biggest dams ever built in Canada. That was one of his babies that he'd been working on for like 20 years. The day he was about to unveil it, he was dead. And people who were there on the ground have testified that there was never an autopsy, and that there was likely bullets to be found in his body if they were ever to exhume his body. That's one thing that was going around. Might have been also poisoning, but no autopsy was done, so nobody will ever know. Point being is it was very convenient for his enemies, who then took over control of Quebec, who de-Christianized it under the helm of people like Pierre Elliott Trudeau and company, who was a major Fabian Society anti-humanist who oversaw martial law on the streets of Quebec in 1970, and the smashing of the viable separatist movement of Quebec at that time that came out broken afterwards. So that's a whole class. Actually, I wrote a book on it. Untold History of Canada, Volume 4, for those who want to dig into that. That's on the website. That's under my name on this page. Today, we're at a very similar pivot. Once again, just like you had with the Bering Strait being fought over during the Civil War and after, you have once more the discussion of extending the Belt and Road Initiative throughout the Arctic and down on through the Bering Strait, where only 55 miles separates Russia from the United States. And the question is, Trump was doing a good job discussing these concrete measurable policies in his first term, towards the end especially. I'd like to see some expectation that this type of conversation happen once more, because if we don't have this, the current orientation is militarization of the Arctic. The current government that we have here, Mark Carney, just like Justin Trudeau, just like Pierre Poilievre, just like the current Albertan government, who I'm very sympathetic to, who's friendly to the separatist independence movement. But all of them are very much in support of the NORAD missile shield and the posture to install long-range missiles in the Canadian Arctic in preparation for the oncoming war against Russia, and especially against China, which certain forces that have been controlling our society wish to destroy completely, because I would say those nations are far too vigorously holding the torch that was left by Abraham Lincoln and Roosevelt and JFK. When you look at how they've been able to build the massive infrastructure and mega projects while also encouraging the growth of a robust private sector and entrepreneurial class. It's not communist. It's not through communism. Nothing by Marx accounts for that type of policy action and outcome. What you will find, though, is that this entirely is abiding by the principles of Henry C. Carey, the greatest American system economist that's ever lived, and who Marx even plagiarized some of that. They lived at the same time, and Marx was actually plagiarizing many of the innovative concepts by Carey and extracting, removing the soul, and creating a new model that became known as communism, outlined in Marx's Das Kapital, which have certain features of, that look attractive to certain people who despise imperialism, and they find the critiques against capitalist imperialism attractive, and I get it. And they find the idea of increasing the productive powers of labor that Marx promotes as a good thing to be attractive, as do I. But the difference is the Marxian idea has no soul. It's a zombie. It's a fake shell. It's a Delphic structure. It's a formula with no essence. It's designed to capture only the outward shell of some of the viable elements of the American system and destroy the moral and reasonable sensibility of the thing that was all contained in Henry C. Carey, who has a much better reason why you need to increase the productive powers of labor. And he had a much better understanding of the science of wages and wage increases and anti-inflationary debt creation It's all there. And when you actually look at the behavior of the Chinese banking system, its national banks and its productive credit emissions, tied as they are to large-scale infrastructure projects, specifically driven by rail and high-speed rail and maglev rail, this is the living essence of that American system today. And I think really that's why Putin said he envies China and their ability to carry out these types of projects, which Russia can't do because Russia submitted the way the Chinese were able to avoid submission to the perestroika, the privatization of their banking system, of their economy during the 90s. They were wiped out, and they've been trying to rehabilitate. China was subjected to the same thing in the 80s, but they did a better job of fending off the George Soros and the CIA and MI6 operatives, and have been de-weeding their deep state garden more effectively than any other nation. And that's why they're very demonized. And there's so much slander and gossip. And I mean, there's so many things from Chinese vampire blood drinkers trying to funnel into the U.S. via the Panama Canal to be a part of Joe Biden's secret Chinese army to suppress conservative patriots, to China's behind our drug problems, to, I mean, you name it, the claims are there. I mean, they make them up faster than you can refute them, but it's all psyop because they want us to hate and fear the thing that we need to work with and recognize as our allies, Russia and China. So, yeah, we'll go into greater detail of that in future presentations. Just quick, Putin did offer in 2007 and then 2011, which this is from Business Insider 2011, where Putin had offered, it says, soon there may be a Bering Strait tunnel connecting U.S. to Russia. Putin had offered paying $60 billion of startup costs to building this tunnel. Great idea. He offered it again in 2016. The Chinese supported it, endorsed it in 2014. It's part of the conception behind the Polar Silk Road. And unfortunately, I haven't heard anybody in the West speaking positively of this who has political influence yet. I want to hear Trump. I want to hear patriots screaming and shouting this to the skies and moving in that direction. The idea of militarizing again with iron domes or golden domes, I find is shady and possibly a trap. I find Carney is a trap as well, who's playing a very, very, I think, dangerous game that I don't know to what degree the patriots in America fully appreciate the layered, sophisticated evil that is being set up and that is represented by the figure of Mark Carney. Again, Donald Trump, first term, based on the strong recommendation of Senator Dan Sullivan and Representative Don Young of the great state of Alaska, it is my honor to inform you that I will be issuing a presidential permit for the A2A cross-border rail between Alaska and Canada. Congratulations to the people of Alaska and Canada. Again, just to repicture it, this was the policy. This is the type of vision that is needed to give vitality to any nation or any aspiring nation. A national bank that works the way W.A.C. Bennett's Bank of BC was supposed to work if it hadn't been sabotaged should be discussed. Productive credit, greenbacks for Alberta, greenbacks for any nation, greenbacks for America. Why not, eh? Why not convert the Federal Reserve into an authentic national bank and erase all of the create a debt jubilee, abandon, forget, press delete on all of the fake, fictitious debt capital that's being held over our heads that's going to explode as a bomb, and then reorganize the way Roosevelt did with the 100-day reform and the bank holiday, that you audit the banks, you force these Wall Street banks, you force bankers to go to prison. And as the outcome, you do Glass-Steagall. You break up the banks, separating the speculators who are going to have to take a loss and maybe collapse, and then protect the real economy, savings, pensions, protect the real economy that's tied to our supply chains. Do that in Canada too. Do that in Alberta. Have a Glass-Steagall or Glass-Steagall renewal. Make that something that people can champion and rally around, because the tsunami is going to come. The bomb is set. It's going to explode. The only way to save people from that oncoming explosion is to do Glass-Steagall. Trump had said one speech about it in 2016 or 2017 and then was induced to stop talking about it. I don't know why. Maybe he thinks that he can work with a lot of Wall Street powerful people who all of a sudden are fully trustworthy. I don't think that they're trustworthy. So let's get some actual pressure to get discussions around restoring Glass-Steagall, break up the banks, put the bankers in jail, right? Get a program for building the healthy tissue that we've destroyed over decades and generations of a consumer society of a wasteland. And let's do it with a vision towards peace. So that's my call to action, and that's the sort of historical lesson I wanted to get across today. Now, unfortunately, without Gordon, as my colleague, as my co-driver of this ship, it's very difficult to follow the comment section and the chats. So unfortunately, I can't really pay attention. I didn't pay attention very closely to the chats. I hope I didn't miss anything too important, but either way, I hope that everybody enjoyed the process. I know there's a lot to go through. I hope you watch the recording again, take some notes, buy the books. I put a lot of work into making these compositions as intelligible for patriots in Canada, the USA, and in Europe as humanly possible. So check that stuff out. Our videos, CanadianPatriot.org. You go there, you'll find a bunch of documentaries tackling different aspects of this history and this future. And otherwise, thank you, everybody, for taking this time today, and look forward to seeing everybody next week. Take care.
Thank you so much for joining us, and don't forget to hit the thumbs up on this video. And a special thank you to all of our advertising partners. Please remember to shift your dollars to support those businesses that support Badlands Media.